I write about people and the different ways of being human. And you can't really do that unless you write about a lot of different kinds of people.
Octavia E Butler. You might have heard of her. Renowned American best-selling science fiction author, mother of Afrofuturism, feminist, dyslexic, and one of my all-time favorite science fiction authors. Octavia published 12 novels during her lifetime. 3 were series, 2 were standalones, and she had 2 short story or novella collections, all of which are fantastic reads, you guys. Now, that doesn't make me an expert on Octavia Butler. I'm just an epic fangirl, and I want to share with you today some of those things about her that make her spectacular. Specifically, I want to talk to you about her 3 signature moves. I want to cover where to start with Octavia, tell you just a little bit about her, and I'm going to go through every single book that she has out and talk a little bit about it.
Why science fiction?
Because there are no closed doors, no walls. I mean, the only rule is if you use science, you should use it accurately. You can look at, examine, play with anything, absolutely anything.
Where to start with Octavia Butler? This is probably the reason why you clicked on this video. I'm going to just list them off and tell you a little bit about why I think you should start with these particular books. I have a variety for you, so you can check out which ones you think you should start with. Hands down, my biggest recommendation for where to start with Octavia is her Hugo Award-winning short story, BLOODCHILD. Not only is this a tiny little digestible snack of what she's capable of, but it has all 3 of her signature moves, and it is one of the weirdest, most uncomfortable, most haunting, and yet compelling stories I have ever read, and it is only 20 pages long. If that doesn't get you, the fact that it is her pregnant man story should. It is a beautiful chef's kiss moment of exactly what she's capable of, and I think it will haunt you for at least the next couple weeks. If you want to start with a novel or you want to know where to pick up next, I have a variety of 3 suggestions.
I have a book called Kindred. It was my 4th published book.
So the first one is going to be the most recommended place, and that is going to be Kindred. This is a standalone novel that I think most people are most familiar with when they talk about Octavia Butler. And this is because this book is probably the most straightforward and contemporary book that Octavia ever wrote, to be honest. It is also one of my least favorite books by her because it doesn't really ask as much from the reader as I know that she is capable of. I think that she has so much more to give than what she shows in Kindred. So is it still a fantastic book? Yes. Is it one of her strongest books? No. So don't worry if you decide to start there. Know that that's how I was exposed to Octavia Butler, and I have no regrets. So if you want a more contemporary book, Kindred is a great place to pick up.
When I was 12, I saw a bad movie called Devil Girl from Mars. I said, geez, I can write a better story than that. Anybody could write a better story than that. Now, of course I couldn't, but it actually turned out to be an ancestor of my first book, PatternMaster.
The next book is PatternMaster. This book is a book that I would recommend to fantasy readers for a place to start with Octavia Butler. The reason why is this is the very first book that she ever put out. And so the structure of the story is a very familiar one. You're going to recognize some of the typical tropes that we see in a lot of contemporary fantasy in this book. And yet she subverts a lot of those tropes, and it's not exactly what you think it is. However, I do think that a lot of people look for that familiar structure or familiar types characters, and there is sort of like a telepathical magical ability in that book. But I do think that the reason I don't necessarily have everyone start with this book is because it is the first novel she ever wrote. So again, she has a lot more to give, and she's just honing her skills in this book. So yes, it's a fantastic place to take off if you want that familiar fantasy trope, but she has so much more to give. The third and final book that I would mention here for people who are like, no, girl, just tell me, what is her best book? I want to hear about her master work, the creme de la creme, her magnum opus. What is that book? I want to start there.
Oh, me!
I'm going to tell you what it is, but I'm also going to tell you, I don't recommend starting with that book first.
Huh?
And the reason is, it's like creating a little bit of disappointment for you to read all the rest of her work because you're reading like her best work, and then everything else is going to be just a little bit not as good. Dawn. This book is, I think, the most fantastic book that she wrote. Definitely a masterwork, and in my top 10 favorite science fiction books of all time. I like it that much. Before we can talk about Octavia's works, we have to talk about what makes Octavia so special.
I see it happening so much. I got the idea for it when I heard someone answer a political question with a political slogan. And he didn't seem to realize that he was quoting somebody. He seemed to have thought that he had a creative thought there. And I wrote this verse. Beware. All too often we say what we hear others say. We think what we are told that we think. We see what we are permitted to see. Worse, we see what we are told that we see. Repetition and pride are the keys to this. To see and to hear even an obvious lie again and again and again may be to say it, almost by reflex, then to defend it because we have said it, and at last to embrace it because we've defended it, and because we cannot admit that we've embraced and defended an obvious lie. Thus, without thought, without intent, we make mere echoes of ourselves, and we say what we hear others say. Just one more comment on the human condition, I guess.
Now you should know that each of these things occur within the books in different levels, and the only book that I think she gets perfection in is the book Dawn, which we already talked about. So the first thing that I think is a signature move is something that she was recognized for during her lifetime, and that was her lean prose. Now, what I mean by that is that every single word in her story is chosen specifically. She doesn't have any extra fat. She doesn't describe any extra things other than exactly what is needed to tell you the story. So we don't get the big overarching picture. All of her stories are all located around the knowledge of a single or two characters. That's it. So if the character doesn't know something, then we don't know it. So there's no descriptions of hard science, there's no descriptions of technology, or even the big political views of whatever world that she's building. But I will argue that I think this particular style of writing is what makes Octavia's work just so transcendent. All of her work, no matter when she wrote it, feels like she wrote it yesterday or last week. It all feels like it transcends time. It's so applicable to everyone because it allows all of our life experiences, and it lets our mind sort of fill in the blanks of the world that we haven't been told the exact details of. And I think that makes it really awesome. Anybody can pick up one of her books and it can transcend any other biases that people come to the table with because of that lean writing style. Everything is in there for a reason. You just have to think about why she would put that in there. Then all of a sudden things make sense. Number 2, she builds these unjust worlds and puts the character in such a position where they have almost no agency or no choice. The plot is something that happens to the character. Because those characters get very few choices, it kind of positions them in a way that they are an underdog or a survivor. This allows most readers to relate to them instantly, because who doesn't want to survive, right?
Come with me if you want to live.
So the few choices that they are given are almost always choices that are impossible choices. Usually it's something along the lines of choosing to pick up a mantle of responsibility that you disagree with and then having to deal with the consequences of that action, or choosing not to pick up that mantle of responsibility that you know you don't agree with and then allowing bad things to happen to people and essentially becoming complicit in the unjust world. It's a really interesting dichotomy, and in doing this, she almost always leaves some kind of relatability, but then also some kind of like, I'm going to call it like an ethical or philosophical aftertaste to her books. Because I'm constantly wondering at the end of the book whether or not I would have made that decision, and to what degree should that character be held to speak for all of the choices that they made. Are they responsible for the consequences of those actions, or are they not? It's both a justifiable decision, whatever they made, but then it's also unethical. And so it's almost always a spectacular point of discussion. Like every single book I finish, I want to talk about with somebody. And I'm like, okay, let's figure out how I feel about this, because I don't understand, or I'm not comfortable, or I'm not exactly sure what the right decision was. And she does a great job of doing this. And that leads me to her Octavia Butler signature move number 3, and that is going to be exploring all of the facets of power dynamics. Now, I know a lot of authors have explored power dynamics in lots of different ways, and plenty of them are good at it. But what Octavia does that is really intriguing is she doesn't shy away from all of the facets that a lot of people don't touch. So we're talking about race, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about gender, and we're talking about social and political beliefs, we're talking about religion, we're talking about all the no-no topics that are involved in the facets of power as part of the experience of a human. And she doesn't just touch on one or another, she touches on all of them all at one time.
By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet!
Which leads you to almost feel like it's overwhelming and it's all shades of gray. And she does this in such a complex and nuanced way, making you think about the characters and the relatability and their situation, and sort of forcing you to ask yourself what you would have done. She tricks you into thinking about what your ethics are and defending them without actually answering the question that she poses. And she changes your perspective by constantly juxtaposing what you understand about the world. What I mean is this. So we all grow up understanding that the strong are over the weak. And yet, in a lot of her unjust world, she presents us a situation in which the weak are over the strong, or the young and inexperienced are over the elderly and wizened. The child is over the adult, the alien is over the human. She just constantly flips the power dynamics, so that way you're forced to think about these perspectives in such a new way. I mean, it's almost like she kind of pits our power dynamics with our pride as humans. She always challenges me in ways I didn't think would be challenging, and I love her for it. And I think that that is really where her true genius lies, is it's up to the reader, and it's up to all of the things that you brought with you to read her book. So she was born in California in the 1940s, and her father was a shoe shiner who died when she was only 7. So loss of fathers and exploration of father figures is something that you'll see occurring in her books very often. Her mother and grandmother, who were housekeepers, were left to raise her, and so she was essentially left alone a lot.
I was alone, and I didn't really think of this as a help at the time. I was lonely, and I made up stories to kind of keep myself company. I was also an only child, so I never really learned to be as social as most kids were. And kids punish you for this kind of thing, so that even when I wasn't alone, when I was around other kids, I still managed to be an outsider. So I guess my writing is at least partly something grown out of alienation.
She said in a lot of her interviews that despite growing up in a very Baptist family, she was considering herself an atheist at the age of 12. And yet she was always happy that she grew up in a Baptist family because it instilled in her values at a very young age. And I find it very interesting that she holds this positive view and yet she considered herself an atheist.
Religion is everywhere. There are no human societies without it, whether they acknowledge it as religion or not. So I thought religion might be an answer as well as in some cases a problem. And in, for instance, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, it's both.
There are quite a lot of terms of speculation on her life. She never questioned her ability to be a writer.
No, I think I had one choice. Well, two choices. I could become a writer or I could die really young. Because there wasn't anything else that I wanted.
So she started writing and started trying to get published at the tender young age of 13. Now, obviously this wasn't very successful, but in her 20s, she met the man and legend himself, Harlan Ellison, who gave her the first useful criticism of her work, and he eventually became a small mentor for her and helped even pay for her to go to some of her first writing conferences where she finally learned the business of being an author. Now, Octavia never married, and she describes herself as an introvert, and even when she was alive, a lot of interviewers described her as an enigma. So I really find that the best way to understand her as a person is, instead of using my words, I want to use her words. She wrote this incredible paragraph in the very last book that she ever published in the About the Author section that I just thought I would read because she does such a good job. I'm also comfortably asocial, a hermit in the middle of a large city, a pessimist if I'm not careful, a feminist, a black, a former Baptist, an oil and water combination of ambition, laziness, insecurity, certainty, and drive. I absolutely love that self-description. I think it is such a powerful one because she embraces all of those combinations and she seems to know herself. It makes me feel like she probably knew secrets that I wish I could talk to her about. Everything I learn about her makes me wish that I could have lunch with the lady, and I have so many questions. Some of my favorite facts about Octavia Butler were found after she died. They went into her house and found huge filing systems, boxes upon boxes, where she had articles from the newspaper, clippings from scientific journals, and I had no idea the level of research that she did to get these 12 novels or these 12 works of fiction, and she spent a long time researching all of the ideas, and you would never know because her writing style is just so fluid. And it was even more interesting that they discovered notebook after notebook of handwritten notes to herself where she visualized her own success. She talks about trying to focus on the feeling and trying to get people to have specific feelings in her work. She also has several notebooks where she visualizes that she is going to be on the bestseller list, and she's going to be on it for many, many weeks. And I think one of the coolest facts, and yet so sad, is that she actually achieved that dream. Despite dying of a stroke in 2006, she did make the New York best-selling Times list. She just made it 15 years after her death. What is fantastic is that it looks like a lot of her books are only becoming more relevant with time, and they're slowly gaining more popularity. So I think she can make it again. Now let's talk about Octavia's work. Finally, right? So the first two I want to cover are the collections. So the first is going to be BLOODCHILD and Other Stories. This is the short story collection. And of the two different collections, I have to say this one is my favorite. And I honestly think that this one is my favorite work by her, because at the end of every story, she has a couple of pages where she describes why she wrote the story, or what inspired her to write it, or how she came up with the idea, or what she was trying to accomplish. And it's so fascinating. It humanizes her, and it makes me feel like I know her on a personal level. And I really value that in this author, especially because she's one of my favorite authors. It makes me feel like I got to go to lunch with her. I would highly recommend reading this one, especially because so many of these ideas appear in their infancy in this book, and yet you can see how they grew, and a lot of them became the novels that she wrote. Next is going to be her novella collection called Unexpected Stories. There are two novellas in this book, and I would encourage you to read them after you read all of the books in the PatternMaster series, just because there are definite spoilers. Now let's talk about the two standalone books that she wrote. And of course we have to start with the first book, Kindred, despite the fact that it is my least favorite of her works. Now, like I said earlier, it doesn't mean it's a bad book. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. It's just that it asks the least from the reader. And she does, in her own way, somewhat spoon-feed answers into this book. It's just so straightforward and more nuanced. Kindred really follows a young black woman in the 1970s, I believe. Her name is Dana. She gets sucked back in time to pre-Civil War America, where there is a plantation happening, and there is a young white plantation owner son drowning in a river. And she has to very quickly acclimate to what is happening to her, and then she gets put into that situation, that impossible choice scenario that is one of Octavia's signature moves. And from there, she has to live with the consequences of her actions. Dana gets offered multiple choices throughout the novel that then she must live with later. And it is an incredible experience to see what a present-day woman would do with the treatment of the slaves back in pre-Civil War era, how she processes those emotions, and kind of what gets her through was a particular element of this book that I really appreciated. I thought it was especially interesting because Dana in California in the 70s is married to a white man who, in the course of the book, also gets sucked back in time with her at least once, and we get to see the differences in their experiences. And there's so many weird ethical choices and quandaries throughout this book that you can't help but understand what this character is going through. But I really liked this book on multiple levels because she never tells you what to think. There is no blame in this book. It is only, this is the experience, this is the facts, this is this one woman's emotions about what happened and what her choices and consequences were really all about. I think this book is definitely one of those books that everyone should read. I feel like it should definitely be discussed in schools. I really appreciated this novel and what she was trying to do, but it wasn't quite as nuanced as I feel like her other books definitely get. For almost all of her works, except for those short story compilations, I want to read to you the first line of each of the books because I think it gives you an idea of what you're in for. I lost an arm on my last trip home. My left arm. There you go. Now contrast that standalone novel with the last book that was ever published formally by her, which was Fledgling. This is Octavia Butler's vampire novel, and I always hesitate to talk about this book on my channel because there's so many elements of uncomfortableness in this book. I think it is very obviously her most controversial book. This is because of the topics that she discusses. The book follows Shori, who looks like a about 12-year-old black girl who wakes up in a cave with a head injury and doesn't remember how she got there or anything about her history. And throughout time, she discovers that she's a vampire, and she learns what that means and what she is and how she functions in the community. There's a lot of tropes and subversive content in this book, specifically because A, she is a black vampire, which is not something that typically occurs in most vampire tropes. Remember that they can't take the sun, and so Shori was made a vampire on purpose because she's black, so that way vampires can now stand in the sun.
It's the Daywalker.
If they're black, which is an interesting dynamic. But what really made this book something that was uncomfortable, I hesitated to recommend it because Shori is in a body of a 12-year-old girl and she doesn't age. So even though her mind is older, there is sexual relationships throughout this book with adults. But then at the same time, she's a vampire and she's a lot stronger and smarter than she may appear. And she creates an addiction in the humans. So who has the upper hand and who has the ability to consent? Wow, there's a lot about consent in this book. So there's a lot of things in this book that really require a lot of discussion and thought. It's not going to be a book for everyone. I don't recommend it for your first read of Octavia Butler. I awoke to darkness. I was hungry, starving, and I was in pain. So those are Octavia's two standalones. Now let's talk about her series. The first series I want to talk about is often called the EarthSeed series. It is a duology, and it starts with Parable of the Sower and goes on to Parable of the Talents. I think these covers are gorgeous and absolutely amazing. Some of the things that you should know about this series: it is considered either apocalyptic or dystopian or both. Unlike maybe other dystopian or apocalyptic books, there is a very significant thread of hope that's running through these books, which is something that I really came to appreciate about Octavia Butler and these particular novels.
You said it's good that I brought both of them together because?
Well, together they are the autobiography of a fictional character who creates a new religion and sets humanity's feet on a different path. Singly, I'm not sure that comes across.
These books follow a girl named Lauren Olamina, who is a black girl in California, who is in 2024. So perfect read for next year. The world and the United States are falling into pieces around her. And there's a lot of social upheaval, there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of anarchy, there's a lot of gangs and violence. Eventually her family gets pushed out of their safety home into the world around them and the violence and the chaos that ensues. And throughout her experiences, despite some of them being very traumatic, she finds hope in kind of inventing a religion. What the tenets of that religion are and how that develops is what these two books are really all about. She forms a community around herself and how that community survives and tries to use that religion to help themselves and create hope in an otherwise very dark and bleak world is a particularly interesting sociologic and psychologic statement about the world. I think that if I read to you the first 4 sentences of this book, it is a little excerpt of one of the tenets of the religion. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. and God is change. And it's a lot of exploration of how we can develop hope. I really thought that even people who are religious sensitive would really appreciate this book. Although I do have to say, very fun fact, EarthSeed is actually a real religion that people do practice. I discovered that with a quick Google search, and you can too. So Ron Hubbard isn't the only one whose science fiction author created a religion. Just saying. Way to be Butler. Anyway, one of the saddest parts of this entire duology is that we will never get the third book, although I do have to say this book does finish on a good climax. I did feel satisfied with the ending, and I think that this is Octavia Butler's most rereadable series. I feel like I could reread these and get something new every time. So these are a fantastic work of fiction, of what she's capable of. I'm really surprised that they have not combined these into a omnibus edition, because the first book does not end on a climax. You definitely have to read the second book to really understand the full breadth that Octavia was trying to get at. She's also a little bit prophetic in some of these in terms of president in the future gets elected under the campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." Now let's move on to her trilogy series. This series is also known as Lilith's Brood. It starts with Dawn and progresses to adulthood rights, and then we finally have Imago. This trilogy, man, what do I say about this? Obviously, you guys already know my gushing review about Dawn. This is in my top 10 favorite science fiction books of all time. What this book is about a girl named Lilith who wakes up and realizes that she has been kidnapped from planet Earth by an alien species, along with the entire rest of the human species. And these aliens have decided that we have killed the planet, and in order to save us from ourselves and our dying planet, they will fix our planet. And as a thank you for doing this, they are expecting unacceptable trade to almost every human on the planet. They decide to wake Lilith, not only to make her accept the price, but also wake groups of humans and force them to accept the price as well. So this is why this series is called Lilith's Brood, because Lilith has to wake up humans in a specific order of her choosing to try to get them used to this idea that is unacceptable and unbearable. There are lots of points of decision making in this book. There's a lot discussing consent, and there's so much in this book to dive into. I could probably write some kind of master's dissertation on this book. It was that layered and that nuanced and that complex. It was above and beyond. It was still accessible though. It's so applicable to our past as well as things in present day, and even, I bet, in some of the future. There's just some things that are inherent to the human experience, and she just captures it so well in this book. And it just made me understand a lot of things that I didn't really get before, and now I do. Hands down, if you're only going to read one book by Octavia, this is the book to read. Just know that it is the best book in her entire novel series, so if you read it, you're going to be at least a little disappointed with all the rest of her work, including the rest of the trilogy. These are fantastic books in and of themselves, but they're just not quite as good as Dawn was. Some of the things that I didn't like about the subsequent novels is they each follow a new character in this series, and I don't like that. I fell in love with the main character of Dawn, named Lilith. You see her every now and then, occasionally in these books, but I wanted to know more of her journey rather than more of, I guess, humanity's journey in the rest of the series. So I was a little bit disappointed in that.
Science fiction was fun because I discovered that I enjoyed reading popular science, and I really enjoyed just speculating. We've all heard the idea that that there are three kinds of science fiction: what if only, and if this goes on. And I didn't know that at the time, but somehow managed to sense it and had such fun, reading things and then going on my own direction with them.
And now for the longest and also most confusing series that Octavia Butler ever did. That is called her PatternMaster series. This consists of 4 books, and there is actually a 5th. The 5th book is a book called Survivor that is now out of print. It's very difficult to get a hold of. The price is absolutely obscene, and I've never read it. Octavia is quoted as saying that she was ashamed of it. She felt like it wasn't actually challenging the tropes of the genre. She didn't feel like it added even to her series. So instead, we're left with 4 books here. Now, one of the reasons why this series is so complex is because nobody really knows the order of these books. So the publishers have come out with an omnibus edition listing all of the books in chronological order that happen within the storyline. But there are a camp of people that believe that you should read them in order that they were published, which is not the same order as what happens chronologically within the story. I read the books in publishing order rather than chronological order, and I don't feel like I missed out on anything. If you're gonna ask me which way I recommend you read these books, I am going to totally cop out and tell you that I don't know that it matters, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So, of all of the books in this series, there are 2 books that deal with the same character. And these are the 2 books that I feel the most strongly need to be read together. I want to go ahead and say that there is a main character in these 2 books named Doro. And Doro has developed a power where he can take over someone else's body. The problem is that the body that he leaves behind dies. So he has been moving through time for centuries, body after body. And he's realized that some bodies are more delicious for him than others. And so he has decided that he is going to breed humans together to create more delicious people for him to take over. I know, right? A little awkward there. WildSeed, which is often the recommended first book of this series, is a story that introduces Doro through one of the women that he is trying to breed. This book will tell you the fate of Doro, whereas Mind of My Mind is Doro's origin story. How he started, how he discovered his powers, how it all works, that kind of thing. So you gotta read these 2 books together. Of these 2 books, my favorite one is Mind of My Mind, by far. But you can decide which order you want to read these books in. I don't think that you're at a loss either way. The other 2 books occur so far outside of the timeline that there are no recurring characters. They really don't have anything to do with the other 2 books in the series. So I almost think that you should view them separately. Read these 2 together in any order you want, and then read these books as standalones. That's honestly my recommendation. PatternMaster was her first book ever, so it was the first one published, and it's allegedly book number 4. I mean, what? This book happens in such a far-flung future that human society is almost unrecognizable, and we get to see humanity has evolved to such a point where some people have telepathic powers, and the levels of those telepathic powers are almost godlike in the best scenarios. So the people who have the strongest telepathic abilities are definitely the highest on the hierarchy, and then it goes down from there. There are less than 1 sentence mentions of the other books, which is very cleverly done because remember, this was her first book. I also think that it feels like her first book in terms of her still trying to figure out exactly what she wants to do with this story. You could read this standalone, no problem. It's not a big deal. Next is the book Clay's Ark. This title is a good summary of what happens. Clay's Ark is a rocket ship that crash lands on Earth. There are aliens in this book, and this book really follows a father of 2 twin daughters, and he encounters like this cult of people in the middle of the desert who tell him that he is not allowed to leave, and neither is his daughters. So he is on a quest to escape, and he discovers why exactly it is that these people don't want him to leave. There's a lot of really interesting ideas in this book. This book is the most science fiction of the PatternMaster books. Remember, Dawn is way more science fiction-y, but this one definitely has some interesting aliens. This one could easily be read as a standalone, and it's supposed to be occurring like during our lifetimes. I really highly recommend the audiobooks. There's a woman named Robin Miles who does a fantastic job with Octavia Butler's stuff. High recommended.
She served her people by giving them relief from pain and sickness.
I want to kind of go back to the idea of where will we find the wisdom to do the right things with the new tools that science offers us. It's not wisdom that we're going to need, really. We'll need it, but we probably won't show that much of it. Let me put it that way. I think what we're going to need is breaks in an odd sort of way, especially when it comes to changing human beings in ways that might not necessarily be good for us. And I think the breaks that we are going to have are religion and politics and a certain kind of economic self-interest. I think we need them. I think we're going to hate them a lot of the time because they seem to be in the way, as they do, as religion does right now, seem to be in the way of certain medical research. But I think it's important that they're there, because without them, we're liable to go charging off and do terrible things to ourselves.
So, you guys, which of these books are you going to start with first? You're going to have to let me know. Those of you out there who have already given Octavia Butler a chance, make a comment in the section down below. Let everyone know what you thought of Octavia Butler's stuff. Definitely go check out some of these books. I highly recommend them. And if you haven't already, come over to the Discord and chat with us about Octavia Butler. And until next time,